Well, it's right there on the cover. The name's right there. Rasul Allah. The Sirah Rasul Allah, written by Ibn Ishaq. Do you have any manuscript from Ibn Ishaq? No. So when you open up the pages of that book and you read the introduction, it's very clear that Ibn Ishaq had nothing to do with that book. In fact, it all comes from Ibn Hisham. That's what it says. But here's the problem. We don't have any manuscript from Ibn Hisham. So who actually wrote that book that you read and that everybody reads today? You want to know? You ready? This old gentleman right here wrote it. Heinrich Ferdinand Wustenfeld, a German scholar who between 1858 and 1860 compiled the biography of Muhammad. He then published it in 1860. That's 160 years ago, and everybody in the world now knew who Muhammad was. Therefore, the man who Muslims are dependent on, and same with you, Abdul, and Raymond who's listening, are dependent on to know who their prophet is or what he did, is an elderly German linguist who wrote Muhammad's story 160 years ago, thus over 1,000 years too late. Did you not know this? Is this the first time you're hearing this? I talked about this over a year ago. So where did he get his material from? That's the next question. Where did he get his material from? You just need to read his notes. Look at his notes. He explains where he gets it from. He goes to 6 different manuscripts. Are you ready? These are the 6 manuscripts he goes to. He does not go to these 2 guys. This is the one he should have gone to, Ibn Hisham and al-Waqidi. He goes to, there he is right there. He went to this manuscript in Fez in Morocco, dated to 1063. And another manuscript that comes from the British Library that's there today, that's dated from 1278. Another one that comes from the Bodleian Library in Oxford, that's 1300s. And another one that comes from Dublin in Ireland, that is the 1300s as well. And then another one that comes from the BNF, the Bibliothèque Nationale de Paris in Paris, that is 1400. And the one he used the most comes from the School of Oriental African Studies there in London, and it comes from 1589. Those are the 6 manuscripts he uses. Notice 5 of them are in Europe, 1 of them's in Morocco. And the one in Morocco he only used 25% of because he didn't trust the other 75%. So none of this comes from anybody named Ibn Hisham or al-Waqidi. They were all written from the 11th to the 16th century. So goodbye, we don't need you guys anymore. Therefore, every Western and Muslim scholar believes that the Sirah compilation was just 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, which is bad enough. Won't they be surprised when they find that they are really much later, between the 11th and 19th century, in other words, between 400 to 1200 years after Muhammad, written by a German scholar. So, who really created the 9th century and the 10th century hadith? Now, Muslims will say that they were all created by, well, we know who they were created by: Bukhari, Muslim, Dawud, Tirmidhi, Majah, and Nasai, all from the 9th century, right? And one from the 10th century. No. That is what they tell us. No, they're all lying. Abu Dawud is from the 11th century. That's 400 years after Muhammad. An-Nasai is from the 12th century. That's 500 years. Ibn Majah is from the 13th century. That's 600 years. Jami' at-Tirmidhi is from the 14th century. That's 700 years. Same with Sahih Muslim. The second most authoritative comes from the 14th century. And Sahih Bukhari, the most authoritative one, the one that gives us 9 volumes, comes from the 14th and 15th century. That's 700 to 800 years after Muhammad. Folks, not one of these hadith were compiled in the 9th and 10th century. Their final extant manuscripts were not created, were not created until the 11th to the 15th century, which is 400 to 800 years later. Thus, not one of them ever heard a word of Muhammad said. This is the first time you're hearing it. Let's put it on a timeline. So that's what they say. They were all written there by those men in the 9th and 10th century. No, they weren't. They start to appear by Ibn Dawud in the 11th century, Nasai in the 12th century, Majah in the 13th century, 14th century for Al-Tirmidhi, same with Sahih Muslim, and the most important, Al-Bukhari, is not till the 14th and 15th century. Goodbye. Don't need those guys anymore. Which means that everything we have about what Muhammad said comes from 400 to 800 years too late. How can you defend him? Now we come and the Tahriq and the Tafsir. Now we've been told that the Tahriq and the Tafsir are written by this guy here, Al-Tabari, and then there are many that come after, Zamakhshari, Suyuti, and Badawi, and the others. But he is the first to write down everything that Islam needs. In fact, everybody loves Al-Tabari because he tells you everything about how you're to walk, talk, eat, drink, sleep, and he tells you all kinds of messed up stuff, and he contradicts himself here and there and gives you the chance to choose what you want. That's why everybody loves Al-Tabari. He was living in the 10th century, so we're told. No, we have nothing from him in the 10th century at all, not a thing. So where do we get Al-Tabari's material from? It was edited by a man named Michael Jean de Geuge, the professor of Arabic at Leiden University in Holland between 1879 and 1901, and is known as the Leiden edition. He went to two manuscripts written in the 13th century, which still exist today in Istanbul. These Arabic manuscripts, these were all written 600 years later, but he didn't put them together and compile them for the whole world to use until the last century. A Dutch scholar. So even Al-Tabari's Tahqiq and Tafsir are not 10th century originals, but are much later 13th century compilations, which were merely attributed back to Al-Tabari 300 years early, yet they are still 600 years too late. What's more, it took a Dutch scholar from Europe to compile them 1,200 years later. Why didn't the Muslims do this? Because the Muslims never wasted time doing this. They had no idea what Al-Tabari said until the last century. Isn't that amazing? And yet Muslims, and Raymond says this is more historically attributable than any other piece of man, any other person. So I'm going to put everything on one screen. You ready? Let's put them all together on one screen. Really get you confused. So let's start with the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. That's when they say they're put up there. That's when they believe that they actually were written. No, we now know that they were written here. Well, no, let's put them away because that's actually the 11th century and the 12th century and the 13th century and the 13th and the 13th and the 13th again. So goodbye to those guys. The Sahaba and Tabi'un never wrote a thing. So we now know, what about the hadith? Well, they were telling us that the 6 hadith were written there. No, they weren't. They were actually written in the 11th, in the 12th, the 14th, and the 15th century. So goodbye to those guys. We don't need them anymore because none of the hadith were written that early. And then we're told that the Sirah was written by those two guys, Hisham and Waqidi, in the 9th century. No, according to our German scholar, looking at his manuscripts, they all start to appear in the 11th. And the 14th century, and then up into the 15th and the 16th century, written by this guy here, put together and compiled by this German scholar. So goodbye to Waqidi and to Ibn Hisham. And then we're told that the Tafsir and the Tahqiq were written in the 11th century by Al-Tabari. No, they weren't. They actually came from 2 manuscripts that are Istanbul, but put together by this Dutch scholar. So goodbye to Al-Tabari, which means, when you look at this, notice, Muslims claim that everything happened 200 to 300 years after Muhammad, right? No, it didn't. What we now know is that everything happened not 200 to 300, 400 to 900 years after Muhammad. And we put a big X in the area that they claim is. So we've been told that the stories surrounding Muhammad's life were written by those who saw and heard him, thus by eyewitnesses or by others within a few generations. Yet we see above that everything we know about Muhammad was originally written 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived, yet not canonized into written text until 12 to 1270 years later, suggesting it is all a fraud. Let me put them all up there. That's what you can give to Muslims. Just get that piece, take that picture, get this PowerPoint, get that picture, and then just give it to your Muslim friends. They've got to come up with an answer to that. Looking at this timeline above, how can Raymond Ibrahim suggest that the history of Muhammad is one of the best supported in history? How can he say that when those who wrote it did so a full 400 to 900 years after he presumably lived? And what's more, what will he do with the fact that much of it was not canonized into written form until 12 to 1270 years later? Is this the best in history? Are you listening to this, Abdul? You're kind of losing your smile, aren't you? It's getting harder and harder, isn't it? I love that. He's got a great smile. Now, as a comparison, folks, be careful. We as Christians have done the same thing. We're just as guilty. You know we are. You know the Gnostic Gospels, 52 found in the Nag Hammadi library in Egypt, written in Coptic, purporting to tell stories of Jesus' childhood, yet were all written in the 4th century and redacted back to the 1st century. But for instance, the Gospel of Thomas, that's the one, Muslims love that one, and the Gospel of Judas, written around the 2nd century, but attributed by their authors to have been written by the disciples of Jesus Christ's time. Look at the Gospel of Barnabas, the favorite of Muslims. The favorite gospel by the Muslims was written in 1634 AD, but was attributed to the companion of Paul in the first century. They were all written in order to give credibility and authority for those who wrote them. So this practice of redaction and attribution is common in every religion, including Christianity. But here's the difference. Here's the difference. Listen to this, Abdul. And Raven, if you're watching. The difference is that while the later Muslim traditions are all considered authoritative, as you see on that graph that I put up there, the later Christian traditions are all considered fraudulent. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Thomas. That's why we don't read the Gospel of Judas. That's why we throw out the Gospel of Barnabas. Why? Because they are all written too late. So we throw out that which is written too late, and the Muslims do just the opposite. They hold on and take the latest material and throw out that which has gone earlier. Do you see the problem? So we aren't doing the same thing. We do just the opposite of what the Muslims do. So what does all this mean? I'm not saying and suggesting that there never was someone called Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi or Al-Bukhari or Sahih Muslim or even Al-Tabari. I'm not saying that. Please don't get that from me today. I'm not saying that because someone certainly had to have created those names somewhere. These men could very well have lived. And they could very well have lived in the 9th and 10th century where they're attributed. Thomas and Judas and Barnabas did actually live. They were actual people. They were real men who were historical characters in the early church and well respected. And that was why the later compilers attributed their works to them. But they did not write the Gospel of Judas or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas. That's all I'm saying. In the same token, neither did Al-Waqidi or Ibn Hisham or Al-Bukhari or Muslim or Al-Tabari write what is purported to have been written by them. Because we have nothing from those men. Similarly, that is why I believe later Muslims attributed the stories back to these earlier men. Consequently, what Muslims today contend these historical writers wrote, they have no support for historically. They have no evidence whatsoever. Since they have little to nothing of what they wrote outside of the Muwatta, which is not even a member of the Islamic tradition, so it should not even be in this discussion. All that Muslims can now be certain of is what the later Abbasids and even the early Ottomans believe happened in the 7th and 8th century. Since everything that had been written earlier had been destroyed and then replaced with completely new stories to fit a new agenda. Conclusion, when compared to Christianity, which has manuscript evidence within the 1st century, Islam is much less historically supported, contrary to what Raymond contends. Yet it shouldn't be, considering how recent it is, supposedly it was created, and all of it written on vellum, on animal skin. They should have the best material. But what about the textual record we have? Remember I said earlier that we have the tafsir and the tahriq and the hadith and the sirah of Jesus, and we have it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and also the writings of Paul. You remember I said that? Let's do a comparative. Now I'm going to step on all your toes. You're not going to like what I'm going to do next, because you're not going to like the dates I did put there. I'm going to put the most liberal dates I can find. But I'm doing that for a purpose. Let's see when they were written down, and let's see how earlier they are. So when you talk about Jesus, we talk about the tahriq. That would be the histories of the early church written by Luke in the book of Acts, written between 52 and 62 AD. That's within 20 to 30 years of Christ's death. Paul's letters to the different churches, that's the tafsir of Jesus. That was written between 48 and 65 AD, within 15 to 34 years. You have the first sirah and the first hadith written by Mark in 70 AD, 37 years of Christ's death. Then you have the next two of Matthew and Luke written in 80 AD, that's 47 years after Christ's death. And finally, you have the last sirah and the last hadith written by John in 90 AD. That's 57 years after Christ's death. Within 60 years, you have the entire New Testament. Within 60 years. Notice that all of these writers, all of these New Testament writers lived in the same place Jesus lived. And they either knew him personally or they got the material from others who saw what he did and heard what he said. So, comparing Christianity versus Islam. When was the earliest biography saying for the both faiths? When we look at Christianity, everything comes together within 60 years of Christ's death, written by those who either saw or heard what he did and heard what he said, or those who got it from the eyewitnesses. Whereas when you look at Islam, everything we know about Muhammad, what he said and he did, comes from 400 to 900 years later. Which would you guess is more authoritative?
Of course, Christianity. Yes.
Are you listening to this, Abdul? Are you starting to get the idea? You've got a problem here, don't you? Yeah, no answer. Just put your thumb up. You're starting to come around. As a comparison, if we had to depend on sources for Jesus, comparable to what the Muslims are dependent on for Muhammad, Jesus would not begin to appear until the 3rd to 5th century. How would we defend him? With statistics like these, how can Raymond suggest that Muhammad is much more historically supported than Jesus? Supposition number 3. If Muhammad did not exist, how do we understand the Sunni-Shiite divide? This is what he says. If Muhammad didn't exist, then no descendants existed either. So how can we understand the Sunni-Shiite divide? Why would there be a huge contention involving the blood descendants of a man who had never existed? Now, to begin with, the first we even hear about Ali as Muhammad's choice is with Sahih Bukhari, volume 5. While the other counter-argument, which goes against that, exactly contradicts it, is also found in Sahih Bukhari, volume 5, book number 64, proving that his companions didn't even know what side they were on. Remember, the canonical version of Sahih Bukhari does not appear until the 14th to 15th century. So this is probably a much later story redacted back. But most importantly, this is a political dispute between Persians and Arabs, not theological. So it could have been created at any time by either the Abbasids or the Ottomans in the 14th and 15th century, and then redacted back first to al-Bukhari and then to the person of Muhammad himself in order to give authority to whichever position, Persian or Arab, you needed for that time and for your place. This is not surprising, as movements, both political and religious, often split, and the Sunni-Shiite divide could easily have arisen for the same reason as the earlier Abbasid revolt, which at its very roots was due to disquiet over the earlier Umayyad dynasty. And here is another response. I'm not going to read through this. You can read through it when your own time, when you get the PowerPoint, by Dr. Pat Andrews. He just shows you, if you have that problem, what are you going to do with the King Arthur and Camelot legend? Did Camelot really exist? Was there a round table? Was there a stone with a sword in it that little King Arthur had to pull out? Well, Disney made that one up.